Sophie Cunningham spoke on Unrivaled, and as she was speaking about it, she clearly spoke on the conflict of interest that Nafisa Collier and Breanna Stewart have with the WNBA in negotiating a new CBA deal.
Okay, so Sophie Cunningham just dropped a massive truth bomb that the entire WNBA community has been thinking, but absolutely nobody else had the guts to say out loud. She went straight for the obvious conflict of interest, calling out how Unrivaled's founders are also high-ranking WNBA Players Association vice presidents right in the middle of crucial CBA negotiations. And get this, she said all of it on her podcast, with a smile, while pretty much everyone else stays totally silent, even when it comes to defending Caitlin Clark from all the unnecessary drama.
So, lads, Sophie Cunningham has said what we all know. She said what we all know, we all agree with. And it's good a WNBA player has finally said it. Because I do think that it's important that, players are talking about this and not just blindly agreeing with what people that we're not fully convinced want the league to continue to happen are saying. Because let's be real, there is a massive conflict of interest with Unrivaled and with NECA now, with everything.
But before we dive deeper into this whole wild situation, I need you to hit that comment section below and tell me, is Sophie Cunningham literally the only WNBA player brave enough to speak these uncomfortable truths? Or are others just choosing to play it safe, protecting their careers and reputations?
For one, we got Sophie Cunningham on her podcast just coming out and saying what so many people have been saying, but you haven't heard it from any WNBA players up until this point. But we know when it comes to Sophie, she doesn't seem like somebody that is going to hold her feelings, her opinions inside. She's just going to...
All right, buckle up, because here's exactly what Sophie Cunningham put out there. And trust me, the details are key. On the November 6th episode of her podcast, Show Me Something, Sophie was just chatting about Unrivaled with her co-host, and then she casually dropped the bombshell everyone's been privately thinking but too afraid to vocalize. She said, and I'm just paraphrasing slightly here, that Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier, they're phenomenal players, total elite athletes, no question, but, and this is the huge twist, they're also both vice presidents on the WNBA Players Association Executive Committee. Oh, and wait, there's more. They also happen to be the co-founders of Unrivaled, which is a competing basketball league that, by the way, pays players significantly more than the WNBA. After laying all that out, she just smiled and casually said, that could be a little conflict of interest. A little, let me tell you, that's the understatement of the century, but at least we finally have someone brave enough to actually say it out loud. It's like if the owner suddenly said, we'll give you
X amount of money, X amount of rev share, since that's the phrase everybody wants to use, but you can't play an Unrivaled. Well, then at the most basic of levels, Nafisa Collier and Breanna Stewart would say, ooh, I don't think we should take that deal because our business, our little baby called Unrivaled, is going to cease to exist if we take this deal. So at the very first step of the negotiation,
So yeah, that's where we see a massive conflict of interest. And here's exactly why this matters way more than people are willing to admit. Right now, the WNBA and its players are in the thick of negotiating a brand new collective bargaining agreement. This isn't just some small chat, this is the monumental contract that will decide everything: salaries, working conditions, even how revenue is shared. This deal is going to shape the entire league for years to come, and it's a huge deal. Now, traditionally, you've got league ownership on one side, and the players' union on the other. The union's whole job is to represent all players equally, fighting for the best possible deal for everyone. That's the theory, right? But here's the kicker in this specific case. Two of the union's vice presidents, people holding immense power and influence, are also running a competing league that quite frankly benefits directly if WNBA salaries stay on the lower side.
Wasn't there. But here's my take about Nafisa Collier. Why she should not be in these, leading these negotiations, the voice of these negotiations or anything like that. She owns and And a rival league. I know it's called Unrivaled, but I think that was an oxymoron, and I think it was done on purpose. This is not Unrivaled. These leagues are rival leagues. And Nafisa Collier, as co-owner, along with Breonna Stewart, owns a rival league. There's always been a conflict of interest. Look.
Now just take a second to really think about that dynamic. Unrivaled is out here paying players in the six-figure range for just a few weeks of work during the WNBA offseason, right? Meanwhile, the average WNBA salary for an entire season is around $120,000. So, if you're a player weighing your options, say playing Unrivaled in the US versus going overseas, Unrivaled suddenly looks a whole lot more attractive when that WNBA money isn't cutting it. What this means, theoretically, is that if WNBA salaries stay low, Unrivaled looks even better by comparison, which directly boosts Stewart and Collier's business. Now let me be super clear, I'm not saying they're actively trying to sabotage CBA negotiations. That would be absurd and frankly unprovable. But the appearance of a conflict of interest, that my friends is undeniable. And appearances are everything when you're talking about millions of dollars and hundreds of players' livelihoods. This isn't some complex legal issue that needs a law degree to figure out. This is pure basic common sense that anyone who's ever watched professional sports immediately recognizes. Think about it. When NFL players considered starting their own spring football league, everyone questioned the conflicts with NFL interests. MLB players with side businesses? There are strict rules about what they can and can't do if it competes with baseball. This isn't new territory at all. The conflict of interest exists, whether anyone wants to acknowledge it or not. And until Sophie Cunningham bravely spoke up on her podcast, not a single WNBA player had publicly stated this incredibly obvious point. So why is that silence so significant? The WNBA has meticulously built this image of unwavering solidarity among its players. This powerful idea that they're all united, fighting together for better conditions and greater recognition. But it turns out that solidarity has some serious limit. Nobody wanted to publicly question whether Stewart and Collier being in union leadership while simultaneously running Unrivaled creates massive problems. Maybe it's because they're popular and highly respected. Maybe players just don't want to rock the boat during critical CBA negotiation. Or perhaps criticizing successful black women entrepreneurs feels uncomfortable, even when completely legitimate concerns are staring everyone in the face. Whatever the reason, that silence was absolutely deafening until Sophie decided she literally didn't care about any of that and just said what needed to be said. Honestly, this is totally consistent with Sophie's entire public persona. She has been one of the very few WNBA players consistently willing to defend Caitlin Clark, while countless others either stayed silent or actively participated in the criticism and even physical targeting. Remember when Caitlin was getting cheap-shotted on the court? Sophie spoke up. When the narrative shifted to Caitlin's popularity being unfair to other players, Sophie pushed back against that victim mentality. When people dared to question if Caitlin deserved her Rookie of the Year recognition, Sophie was out there loudly saying, actually, yeah, she absolutely does. And now, when everyone is tiptoeing around this glaringly obvious unrivaled conflict of interest, Sophie is still the one saying, hey, this is really weird, and we definitely need to talk about it. So the big question remains, why does Sophie seem to be the only one willing to speak these uncomfortable truths? One possibility is that she's just more secure in her position, less worried about potential backlash. She's an established player, a solid career, she's got her podcast, and she frankly doesn't seem to care about being universally liked. Another angle, maybe she genuinely believes that transparency and honesty are simply more important than maintaining comfortable fiction. Or, you know, maybe she just doesn't have that polished filter most professional athletes develop, where they learn to speak in platitudes and meticulously avoid controversy. Whatever the underlying reason, the result is clear. She consistently ends up being the voice articulating what huge portions of fans and media are thinking, but other players simply refuse to acknowledge. Let's actually get into the nitty-gritty of why this conflict truly matters on a practical level. Nafisa Collier has been one of the most vocal WNBA players about salary frustration. She's publicly declared that WNBA players deserve significantly more money, which, let's be honest, is a totally valid position that most people agree with. But here's where things get really complicated. She's making those powerful statements while also running a league that directly competes for players' time and attention. And she's arguing that the WNBA isn't paying players enough. So, is she doing that purely as a union representative, advocating for her peer? Or is there also a business motivation, where keeping WNBA salaries lower makes Unrivaled look much more attractive by comparison? Again, I'm not accusing her of bad faith, but the optics here are undeniably questionable. Breanna Stewart's position is similarly complex. She's an absolute legend of the game, one of the most decorated players in WNBA history, someone whose voice commands enormous weight in any league discussion, but she's also a business owner whose business thrives, partly because WNBA schedules and salaries leave ample room for players to chase additional opportunity. If the WNBA suddenly started paying players average salaries of $300,000 and extended the season, would players still be as interested in Unrivaled? Maybe, maybe not. But that critical question exists, and it creates, at the very least, the appearance that Stewart's union leadership role and her business interests might not always perfectly align. Some people have tried to dismiss these concerns by arguing, well, Unrivaled doesn't happen during the WNBA season, so there's no conflict. But let's be real, that argument is ridiculous for multiple reasons. First, players can get injured in Unrivaled, and that absolutely impacts their WNBA value and availability. Teams are pouring millions into these players, and any additional basketball played anywhere inherently creates injury risk that directly affects those investments. Second, the financial competition is completely real, regardless of the timing. If players can earn comparable or even better money in a shorter Unrivaled season, that profoundly affects their leverage and priorities during WNBA negotiations. Third, attention and fan engagement are finite resources. Every minute fans spend watching Unrivaled is time they're not spending watching WNBA content or engaging with WNBA players' brands. The competition is there, whether it's direct or indirect. Another common defense is, oh, but Unrivaled is 3-on-3, not 5-on-5, so it's not really competing with the WNBA. Seriously? This is just semantics over substance. It's professional basketball played by WNBA players for money. The format being slightly different changes nothing about the fundamental dynamic. These are competing professional basketball products. It's like saying the XFL didn't compete with the NFL because the rules were slightly different. Of course they competed. They battled for players, for viewers, for sponsors, and for cultural relevance. Unrivaled and the WNBA exist in the exact same ecosystem, and pretending otherwise is either incredibly naive or just deliberately obtuse. What truly makes Sophie's willingness to address this even more notable is the broader context of how the WNBA generally handles dissent. This is a league where players have historically maintained incredibly strong public unity, sometimes to the point of circling the wagons even when legitimate criticism is valid. Questioning leadership decisions, calling out problematic dynamics, or breaking from the collective narrative can genuinely result in social consequences within the player community. Sophie did it anyway, which strongly suggests either she simply doesn't care about those consequences, or she believes this issue is so profoundly important that it's worth risking them. Either way, it takes a monumental amount of courage that apparently most other players either don't possess or aren't willing to exercise. The timing of this entire conversation is also hugely significant, because those CBA negotiations are happening right now. These aren't some abstract future discussions. The decisions being made in these negotiations will literally determine WNBA players' working conditions and compensation for years to come. Having union leadership with potential conflicts of interest during these specific negotiations creates problems that go far beyond mere theoretical concern. Players absolutely need to trust that their union representatives are fighting solely for the players' collective interests, not constantly juggling those interests against personal business consideration. That trust becomes incredibly difficult to maintain when obvious conflicts exist and nobody is willing to even address them. It's worth pointing out that conflicts of interest don't automatically equate to wrongdoing. Many people navigate competing interests with integrity and complete transparency, but the standard practice in any professional or business context is to fully disclose conflicts, recuse yourself from relevant irrelevant decisions or completely restructure roles to eliminate the conflict altogether. As far as anyone publicly knows, none of that has happened here. Stewart and Collier remain in their union leadership positions while still running Unrivaled, and apparently nobody except Sophie thinks that's even worth discussing openly. That's just not how conflicts of interest are supposed to be handled in any professional context, let alone one involving millions of dollars and hundreds of players' career. The broader pattern with Sophie Cunningham is simply that she consistently seems to be the player willing to say the uncomfortable things that desperately need saying. When the narrative around Caitlin Clark became absolutely toxic and other players either piled on or stayed silent, Sophie defended her. When people questioned if the physical play against Caitlin was appropriate, Sophie called it out directly. So when Angel Reese's Rookie of the Year campaign was being aggressively pushed despite objectively inferior statistics, Sophie made it crystal clear that Caitlin deserved the recognition. Now, when there's this glaringly obvious conflict of interest that everyone else is conveniently ignoring, Sophie's the one fearlessly pointing it out. That consistent track record suggests this isn't about seeking attention or just stirring drama. This is apparently just who she is, someone who values honesty over comfort. The reaction to Sophie's comments, as you might expect, has been predictably mixed. Some fans and media members have applauded her for finally saying what truly needed to be said. Others have shamefully accused her of creating division or being jealous of Stewart and Collier's success. The latter criticism is particularly absurd because acknowledging a conflict of interest has absolutely nothing to do with jealousy. This isn't about whether Unrivaled is successful or whether Stewart and Collier are brilliant businesswomen. This is about whether people in union leadership positions should simultaneously run directly competing business venture. Those are completely separate questions, but sadly, nuance often gets completely lost in online discourse. One crucial aspect that hasn't been discussed nearly enough is what this truly means for younger or less established players. If you're a fringe WNBA player whose entire career could be fundamentally affected by CBA decisions, how do you genuinely feel knowing that your union leadership has business interests that might not perfectly align with yours? If you're someone who can't secure an Unrivaled contract but would benefit enormously from significantly higher WNBA salaries, do you truly trust that leadership is prioritizing your interests? These aren't just hypothetical concerns, these are real pressing questions that affect real people's lives and careers. And before Sophie spoke up, apparently nobody in player leadership thought these questions were even worth addressing publicly. The comparison to other professional sports leagues here is incredibly instructive. When NBA players have outside business interests, there are strict disclosure requirements and clear ethics guidelines. When NFL players have potential conflicts, those are meticulously documented and managed. The WNBA is a professional sports league dealing with serious money and complex business decisions. Operating with the same standards and transparency that govern other professional leagues isn't unreasonable, it's fundamental professionalism. Yet somehow, pointing that out makes Sophie Cunningham the controversial one, rather than the deeply problematic situation itself being seen as controversial. Looking ahead, this issue isn't magically going away. Unrivaled is already planning future seasons. GBA negotiations will continue. The fundamental conflict will persist unless something structurally changes. Either Stewart and Collier need to step back from union leadership, or they need to completely divest from Unrivaled, or there needs to be some incredibly transparent process for managing this conflict. Just ignoring it and blindly hoping nobody notices isn't a sustainable strategy, especially now that Sophie has bravely said out loud what everyone was thinking. The cat's officially out of the bag, and pretending it isn't there won't make it disappear. What this ultimately reveals is a much broader problem with how the WNBA handles difficult conversations in general. There's this deeply ingrained tendency to prioritize maintaining a positive public image over transparently addressing legitimate concerns. Players are implicitly expected to present a united front, even when that unity means consciously ignoring obvious problems. Anyone who dares to break from that expectation gets branded as a troublemaker rather than someone genuinely raising valid points. That's simply not healthy for any organization, and it's particularly problematic in a league that's striving to establish itself as a major professional sports entity. Professional leagues demand professional standards, and that absolutely includes addressing conflicts of interest openly and honestly. So, there you have it. Sophie Cunningham finally said what nobody else had the courage to say. There's a glaring, undeniable conflict of interest with Unrivaled's founders being union vice presidents during critical critical CBA negotiations. If breaking this down for you was worth your time, then please smash that like button and subscribe for more honest no-holds-barred takes. And seriously, comment below, is Sophie the only WNBA player with the guts to speak the truth, or what?